Think of reality TV, the first thing I think of is a game show. And so we're going to start with a little quiz for you guys. Some forgotten words, or words that you don't hear very often anymore. For instance, what is debauchery? Is debauchery a toxin from improper canning? Maybe a sudden failure? It might be debacle. Maybe it's overindulging in sensual pleasure. What about carousing? What is that? Perhaps that's riding face courses in a circle, or awaking others by honking your automobile horn. No. Carousing is drinking alcohol and noisily celebrating with others. And here's the last one, licentiousness. Probably a word you use 3 times a day, I'm sure. Licentiousness, is that a process for making soap? Is that telling untruths about an odor? Licentiousness? Or lacking moral restraint? Lacking moral restraint. So these are words we don't use very often anymore. Some of them are in the NIV and the English Standard, and I mean, they're not just King James words, but really the issue is sin is a word that we don't, in the world at least, use very often. You don't hear on a regular TV show somebody talking about sin. It's a very Bible-y, churchy word that just, I think to the world and to a lot of people, just sounds out of touch. Like, come on, man. Loosen up, man. It's 2023, and we're still talking about sin. What an old-fashioned idea, like all those old-fashioned words we were just talking about. Licentiousness and carousing. Next thing you know, we'll have a Salem witch trial or something. What's going on here? Are we just too uptight when we think about sin, when we're talking about sin? Well, we need to talk about sin. I always heard a story about the brother who asked a man sitting in his congregation, what do you think about sin? And he said, I'm against it. And we definitely need to be against sin. But we need to understand sin and recognize how destructive it is and understand that God draws the lines for what sin is. And those lines are for our good always. Sin is dysfunction in a life and sickness in a soul. It's stepping away from God's boundaries for a good life, and it mars and twists and alienates. It breaks what is good, His good world. It breaks our relationship with Him. It breaks our relationships with others. It breaks good things like marriage. It breaks good things like the physical intimacy God designed for marriage. It breaks friendships and destroys our thinking, so we get darker and darker, so we live in untruths. How comfortable are we with sin? Do we need a reality check? Sin is still sin, right? An old idea. God is still the one who sees you as you are. God is still the one who knows you better than anyone and knows what you need, knows how to make you whole and right and alive. The word sin, in the Hebrew word for sin meant missing the mark. In fact, it was used in some of the historical books for when some sharpshooters would hit like a very small target, or when they would miss the mark. And it wasn't, no moral connotation to it at all with that usage. But it has a great moral connotation when God talks about us missing our purpose, missing what we're here to do, failing at life. That's what sin is. Failing or falling short of the glory of God. There's two other words used over and over again in the Old Testament with that word for sin. They're translated transgression and iniquity. In Leviticus 16, whenever you read about the Day of Atonement, you'll find this over and over, sin and transgression and iniquity. And those other two words have connotations like breaking relationships, shattering covenants and bonds, and that which makes the fabric of a community. And then the other word has the sense of twisting or perverting or marring, putting graffiti all over something beautiful and wonderful, like taking going into the Louvre and go into the Mona Lisa and just taking spray paint all over the painting itself, as if you could get to the painting itself. But, just wrecking something that is meant to be good and honored. That's this world. That's you. That's me. That's our marriage. That's the people around us. That's, all the good things God made. And sin is the destroyer. That's why we take it seriously. So I want to encourage you to open your Bibles. We're going to just focus on this one verse, 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 3, that has a list of some old-fashioned sins. And I say old-fashioned, kind of tongue-in-cheek, from the standpoint that there's some of these words and ideas we don't talk about very often. But it makes it all the more important. And there's a message that Peter has for us that I hope we can get. I hope that as young people, you take this to heart. I hope that those of us who maybe think we've heard all this before, take these messages to heart about what Scripture is trying to tell us about sin. Peter says in the English Standard, "For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do." In other words, you've had enough time in that mess, like the prodigal son getting out of the pigsty and coming home at last. Why would you want to go back? You have had enough time of it. Loosen up, man. It's just sin. No. God says enough. You don't want it. You don't need it. It'll kill and destroy you. But he says living in, as in this is a way of walking, living in sensuality and passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. So that's our verse. That's what we're going to get into, and some of these words that define a picture of sin for us. You guys need anything from me? Okay. All right. So I see three groups here that we're going to talk about this in: sensuality and passions, and drunkenness, orgies, and drinking parties. The first one has to do with sexual sins, or sins that are in that realm of sensuality. The second has to do with drinking. And then finally, there's this idea of lawless idolatry. Okay, so those are the three groups we want to look at. And I'm going to bust out the books, so to speak, and give you, this is a word study sermon. So I'm going to share with you some things about the original Greek words here and their context in the culture. Whenever Peter is speaking about Gentile culture, he's saying this is how people are living. And he's talking to some Gentiles who now know better. And he says, don't go back to that. Don't live like that anymore. And so we're going to dive into these words. I'll think with you about the English versions, English words and the Greek words. But sensuality and passions. King James, lasciviousness and lust. Lasciviousness, another word people don't use very often. But man, I got to tell you, this idea, especially if you're not in a marriage relationship, but you're in another kind of relationship, romantic relationship, is so important. Whatever of these words you want to use, you got to get the idea. Lasciviousness and lust, debauchery and lust, sensuality and lust, lasciviousness, Young's literal translation says, and desires. Okay, so let's think for a minute about these words. Okay, so first let's think about sensuality. This comes from a Greek word, asolgeia. And Jesus includes it in a list of sins in Matthew 7:22. It characterizes Sodom and Gomorrah in 2 Peter 2:7 and the pagan world generally in Ephesians 4:19. Jude 4, this is interesting, says that asogeia, lasciviousness or sensuality, is ultimately a perversion of the grace of God. And there is this sense of sexual excess in all of these words. So sensuality, Merriam-Webster defines it as affecting the senses in a pleasing way, pleasant, attractive, or appealing. So this is this idea, a thing it's come to mean. But the meaning here in this section, in a way, it produces or suggests feelings of physical or sexual pleasure. Produces or suggests feelings of sexual pleasure. Lasciviousness, same word, filled with or showing sexual desire. Debauchery, same Greek word again. Bad or immoral behavior that involves sex, drugs, alcohol, etc. But in this case with this word, extreme indulgence in sensuality. Licentiousness, sexually immoral or offensive, lacking moral restraints, especially discarding sexual restraints. Okay, so what are we talking about? Notice he's not saying this is the act of fornication as we think of it. He's saying this is all the stuff that is producing or suggesting feelings of physical or sexual pleasure. That which produces those feelings. So it's all the things around it, that what could produce or suggest those feelings. Well, it could be the way you touch each other. It could be the way you dance or dress or, snuggle up next to each other or, certainly a makeout session or all of those kinds of things that you think about. The idea here is that there is a different line than we didn't commit that act as you might think of it. There is a different line that defines sin. I think of, I know this is a pretty heavy lesson, lighten it up just for a second. You guys remember the movie It's a Wonderful Life? Okay, so It's a Wonderful Life, I think it's my favorite Christmas movie. I love it. And there's this scene where Jimmy Stewart, Donna Reed are there, and they're going back and forth dancing as the floor under them in the gymnasium starts opening up. Remember that scene? But they don't realize that the floor is opening up. Everybody else is watching them go right up and almost fall off, and they're, oh, and then they go back, and then they go over here, and whoa, and they keep thinking, oh, are they going to go in? Oh, it's okay. But see, if you don't know where the line is, you got to just stay back away from it. Stay back away from anything approaching that line, anything that is producing or suggesting feelings of physical or sexual pleasure. In other words, all of that excess, all of that throwing off the restraints and just feeling good and doing what feels good is what we're talking about. That loosen up, man, that's actually essentially the definition of that word, loosening up. Loosening up is the problem when we loosen up the boundaries, loosen up our restraints, our moral restraints, and don't have clear boundaries, It's like that old picture of whenever the water doesn't have firm banks, then it becomes a swamp. But when the river has banks, then it can flow. It's bordered so that it becomes clear and healthy and alive. And then this other word for passions just describes desires. And of course, it's talking about these unchecked physical desires. When I think of all of this, this sensuality and passions, and this idea of loosening up, going back to our reality theme, it makes me think of a show that just breaks my heart, just troubles me so much every time I've walked into someone watching it. It's the show The Bachelor. I know it's been on for 27 seasons or something. You've probably heard of it, and it's like 20 women, or on the other side with The Bachelorette, all these men. These women, for instance, with The Bachelor, are throwing themselves at this man in desperation for his affection with no commitment, no covenant, nothing except just this desire to have a relationship like this. And, there's all kinds of unchecked sensuality because there's no boundaries. That's a picture of this in the world. Another reality show that was going pretty disturbing, that was going for about 9 or 10 years, as I understand it, and just recently stopped, is this show Drunk History. And what they would do in this show, another reality television show, is get somebody drunk, and by their own, they're agreeing to do this, to get drunk, and then they take them up to a hotel room or something, and they sit them down and they have them tell a story. And then it's reenacted in front of you while you're hearing the narration by this drunk person who is just out of their mind and doesn't know what they're talking about, and they're trying to tell the story of George Washington chopping down a cherry tree or something crazy. So, it's like a simple thing that becomes this weird telling. And this is entertainment. This kind of inebriation and the way that it's being processed is just as good fun. So there's these 3 words: drunkenness, orgies, and drinking parties. Excessive wine in King James, revelings and banquetings, drunkenness, orgies, carousing. Drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, excesses of wine, revelings, drinking bouts. So these are all these different words, and there's really 3 different ideas, and it's kind of what Peter's doing here, as you'll see as we get into the words, is he's drawing a spectrum from high quantities of alcohol to moderate, a middle level of alcohol to lesser alcohol. And so this word for drunkenness, I think, is pretty obvious. Probably we all understand what drunkenness is excessive amounts of alcohol. But this word orgies is an important word to understand. It's the word komos, and it means, according to the Lexham Analytical Lexicon, excessive feasting. And originally, it described a festal procession in honor of Dionysus, which will make my kids' ears perk up because they study Greek mythology all the time. And so the BDAG, one of the more famous and respected Greek lexicons, compares this feast of Dionysus to our festival, the American festival of Mardi Gras in New Orleans. Just this wild, wild party. And then after that, a meal or banquet. And so this is a picture of a certain kind of wild party where there's noise and there's people all together. And, it's like, if you showed up at a wild high school kegger or something, or college kegger, that's what you'd see. But there's parties at all ages of this kind of wild party. And then this last word, again, so it's kind of going down and giving different context in each of these words. This last word for drinking parties or banquetings or carousing is for a social gathering at which wine was served. So it's just a social gathering, a more moderate social gathering where, the kind of thing that, this is quoting BDAG again, the lexicon. In the Greek-Roman world, it was customary for literati to hold banquets at which topical discussions were featured. with participants well lubricated with wine. These would not properly be rendered carousals. This is not a wild party. This is more like, Oprah's book club. You sit down with Reese Witherspoon's or whoever, a bunch of ladies maybe are sitting together, and they're just drinking a glass of wine while they're talking about their book, okay? Or not picking on the ladies, or some guys over a business dinner just are talking and having what we would call social drinks, right? And so this is what this term is referring to, is just being well lubricated in this kind of elite cultural circle was the general cultural associations according to the authorities on the language. When I say loosen up, man, come on, what's the big deal? And what Peter is saying is, maybe that was fun. Maybe you enjoyed it once, but you have done enough of that, and God has a better way for you. The time that has passed suffices. And then finally, I think of this, the show American Idol, and it's just a singing show. The only thing that really bothers me, to be honest, is just the name, American Idol. And I understand, we have this idiom in our culture. We talk about people who are figures that everybody looks up to as idols. But this word is actually a really important word in the Bible. The English word idol comes from the Greek word. It's this word, idolatria. Idolatria is the word for idol. And it's a derogatory term for image worship or idolatry. And this is in a catalog of vices, the works of the flesh in Galatians 5:20. But interestingly, it is descriptive of greed in Colossians 3, verse 5. Covetousness is idolatry. And so we're back around to Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? We're back around to that issue of putting whatever it is, even the mighty dollar, whatever it is, whatever you are. Coveting just means you want something, and you want it deeply, and you're craving it, and you're reaching for it. And if that's not God that we're reaching for, at the center of everything that we're longing for, at the center of our desires, then it's idolatry. And that's why he says covetousness is idolatry. That kind of greed, that depth of desire for something that is in the place of God. And there's this word with that of lawlessness or abominable. And the word just means something that isn't accepted or proper to anybody. It's just not seemly. That which is lawless. And so these are things we take seriously. We don't say, sin, what's the big deal? God says sin, ! Is a problem. Here's how big a problem it is. God says, I'm going to send my son to die, to take away the sin problem. And the sin problem is the problem we all have until we come to God's Son. The sin problem is the human condition, the condition that brings death, the condition that brings all of the troubles of the world. And when we come to Christ, he who has conquered sin can conquer sin in us. And so that's the invitation tonight. If you would come to Christ and let him conquer sin in you, through your trust in him, your baptism, we invite you to come now while we stand and sing.